want to show you how you can make a super saw sound for yourself using a saw wave from 3 body compared to detect a gate from the saw wave, and I'm going to use select to mix the gate that I extract with compared to and the original saw wave. And we should be able to see on the scope how, should you have a bunch of these, you could really make a super saw sound. Let's first just connect a saw wave here to the oscilloscope. Let's sync the scope. And what we need to do is send this saw wave to a comparator. I'm using compare to, which is a dual window comparator. What this does is send out a high gate whenever the signal that we send in is between 2 voltages. So where we take that output and we look at it on the scope, you can see that with these settings, the comparator sends out a high gate whenever like the saw wave is around 0. Mind you, the T here, I hope you can see it, this orange T here represents the center line for this green saw wave. If I move around the settings on the comparator, you can see how the gate that it sends out is changing. We can shift the window into the positive voltages, and then you can see that we only get a high gate whenever the saw wave is above this barely visible line. The interesting thing happens when we mix this gate and that same saw wave together. Let me patch this into select 2. I'm going to need a multiple here for my saw, like that. And if I send this into select 2 as well, I can extract a mix from the last channel's output. Let's have a look at that. So right now you can see on the scope that we get something that does not really represent a regular saw wave. Let's listen to this. I hope it's not too loud. Like that. Let me change the settings on the comparator a little bit. So for example, now we're just sending out a high gate whenever the saw wave travels in the negative, into the negative voltages. And then you should be able to see how I can create this saw wave, this red saw wave on the bottom here, that is different in phase from the one that we started with. And this is just by carefully setting the levels of the saw wave and the gate here. So this is just the gate, and if we add the saw wave, at some point we have this nice result. And if I now move around the window of our comparator just ever so slightly, you can see how we can change this bottom saw, well, we can change the phase of this bottom saw wave here. And if we play this together with the original saw wave, so this is the saw wave that is phase shifted. And let me connect the original saw wave to our right ear. But maybe I should do it the other way around. So this phase shifted one, the red one, is going into our right ear. And the original saw wave coming from 3 body here is going into our left ear. And if I now play around with the pitch of the saw oscillator, you can see that our phase shifted saw wave nicely follows the pitch here. And then if I play around with the settings on the comparator, you can see that within a certain margin we can really affect the phase of this saw, of this red saw. And if I move this around with CV, you can hear how we get a nice thickening of this sound. Now imagine that you do this with a bunch of comparators, you mix all of them together, but then you get a nice super saw, a nice thick and warm super saw sound. In the short jam at the end of the video you will hear how I made 2 of these mixed in stereo, which should get you a nice impression of what you can do if you patch up your own super saw. But while this is a nice science experiment and a nice way to figure out how a comparator like Compare 2 actually works, it's so much easier to just use a dedicated module for the super saw sound, like the Super Sauter, which I think uses this same principle to extract several phase shifted saw waves from one saw wave. Because, well, this doesn't exactly work when you send in a triangle wave. I mean, you don't get a nice triangle as a result. You get these different shapes, which are still very interesting, especially if you mix a bunch of them. But you cannot call this super saw anymore, of course. Let's just, for the fun of it, see what this does to a sine wave. And as you can see, this is rather interesting, but not a super saw. Let's have a look at the Happy Nerding Super Sautor instead, which helps us creating super saws much faster. Thank you, by the way, to Happy Nerding for sending me Super Sautor and a few other modules so I could use them in making this video. And thank you to my Patreon and Ko-fi people for the continued love and support. Before I get carried away here, let's just look at a few really basic things. And I hope that way you should be able to get an idea of how Super Sautor works, or at least how it behaves in a setting together with other modules. The upper trace on zero scope here is a saw wave that I'm sending in coming from the even VCO here. The bottom trace is the actual output of Super Sautor. And as you can see, when I turn down the spread here, we go back to a regular sounding saw wave. But it seems to take a while to settle. Sometimes it doesn't really go completely back to being a perfect saw wave. I find this really, really interesting. And by the way, now that I've read through the manual a little bit more thoroughly, I'm pretty convinced that the method that I explained earlier for creating super saws is totally not what's happening inside Super Sawtor by Happy Nerding, simply because, let me turn this filter down a bit, simply because what I did earlier was actually saw animation, waveform animation. We created a phase shifted version of the same saw wave at the same pitch, and then we shifted the phase around with modulation. What's happening in Super Sawtor is that it takes 6 copies, well 7 if you include the normal pitched one, but it makes 6 copies. 3 of them are pitched lower and 3 of them are pitched higher than the source saw that we send in, which creates a subtly different sound. And I'm sure the circuitry behind this is completely different than what I showed you earlier. But there is a lot of resemblance in these sounds, even though I think the version of the circuitry with a pitch shifting, however it is done, I have no idea, because all of this is analog. I think this one inside Super Sawtor sounds much nicer actually. So let's open this filter here. This is the MMM VCF by Happy Nerding as well. It sounds absolutely great for anyone that wants those type of sounds. And if you know what the MMM is based on, you know what I mean by those sounds. It's really good at them. Anyway, let me turn up the mix knob here. This is just a dry wet control. You can see that the output is a little bit attenuated when I turn it to the left, so totally dry. And when I turn it to the right with the spread at 0, the signal is a little bit hotter than what we send in, but this changes as soon as I turn up the spread amount, which, well, it says itself what it does. It spreads the voices. And look on the scope how awesome this is behaving. This is not a static sound, this really is alive, and I think that's what makes it sound warm in my opinion. So by turning up the spread you increase the pitch shift of the 3 voices that are shifted down and the 3 voices that are shifted up. Like I said, there's one in the middle that's unchanged. Let's tune up my oscillator here. I like it when it's, well, a little bit below halfway. Let me introduce a melody here to my VCO. This is really just a random melody You can read in the manual well, a few ideas on how to use the CV input here. The CV input and attenuverter here acts on the spread control. So if I turn this down and I send in an envelope here, then I need to bring up the level of this attenuation, of this modulation with this attenuverter. So this is an envelope that I'm sending into the CV, which is now controlling the spread. The position of the spread knob here acts as an offset to whatever we send in. We can invert our modulation, which is something that sounds complete outer worldy to me. I really like that you can do this with the module itself. You don't have to start inverting your envelopes. Let's bring down the filter a little bit here. The modulation of this envelope is used for the filter as well. Let's bring up some effects with the FX8 Pro here. Yeah, I really like this. We can also send in like stepped modulation, like pitch CV or anything that you want really. Let's turn up the attenuverter. So this LED cable, by the way, it is green light when the signal, the CV is positive, and it's a red light when the CV is negative. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but send back in the envelope. I did something wrong here. That. Let's increase the attack portion of this envelope a bit. Let's turn down setting here. I think that's really, really cool. Let's pitch up a bit. Let's remove the modulation. And as you can see, if I turn up the spread really high and turn down the mix, you can introduce some subtle movement, some subtle life to your VCO. Let's pitch down. But like I said, I like it somewhere halfway here and then just turning the mix up really high. I mean, this sounds absolutely amazing to me. Then if I bring down this ladder filter here. Let's reintroduce the effects from the Effects 8 Pro here. Absolutely great. And I think the results we are getting here are much more enjoyable than what we did earlier with the saw wave animation that we did with the patch with Compare To. But like I said, it's really fun experiment to try it and patch this kind of super saw sound or animated saw wave sound for yourself. But well, really, why bother if you can just have the ease of dialing in that awesome sound. With this Super Sauter. This is it for this video about super saws. I hope you learned something about the Happy Nerding Super Sautor and how to create your own super saws. Thank you for watching, and let's end this video with a short jam. For this jam I'm using a self-patched super saw with Compare To. And let's increase the modulation speed. See you next time.